Toxic people don't survive because they're powerful. They survive because they get attention. They provoke. They drain. They pull you into explanations, reactions, and emotional loops. And every time you engage, you keep them relevant. Machiavelli understood something most people miss. You don't defeat toxic people by confronting them. You defeat them by removing their function. Because toxicity isn't strength, it's dependency. In this video, you'll learn the one psychological shift that doesn't fight toxic people, doesn't argue with them, and doesn't try to fix them. It makes them irrelevant. And once someone becomes irrelevant, they lose power automatically. Stay until the end, because this isn't about being passive, it's about becoming unusable. Why toxic people need you more than you need them. Toxic people don't survive because they're strong. They survive because they're fed. Their behavior runs on reaction and emotional access. Without it, they weaken quickly. This is the part most people misunderstand. They believe confrontation is power. They think pushing back will shut toxic behavior down. It rarely does. Toxic people don't escalate when challenged. They escalate when ignored. Challenge still gives them what they want. Engagement. It tells them they matter. It tells them they've entered your emotional space. Conflict is their oxygen. Arguments energize them. Explanations sustain them. Defensiveness confirms their relevance. Even negative attention keeps them central. This is why toxic people often provoke calmly. They don't need to win the argument. They just need you inside it. Once you react, the loop is active. They now know what irritates you, what pulls emotion out of you, how much access they have. And access is leverage. Ignoring them feels counterintuitive because it triggers guilt. It feels passive. It feels like losing. But Machiavelli understood something colder. Relevance is power. The moment someone can reliably pull a reaction from you, they are no longer weak. They are positioned. This is why toxic people often grow louder when ignored, not because they're winning, but because they're starving. They escalate to restore relevance. Most people misread this escalation as proof that ignoring doesn't work. In reality, it's proof that it does. Engagement validates relevance. Silence removes it. Once relevance disappears, toxicity loses purpose. No audience, no reward, no leverage. This is not avoidance. It's starvation. And once you see what toxic people actually feed on, confrontation stops making sense. Comment, "I don't feed reactions," or comment, "Relevance is the weapon." Because the moment you stop supplying emotional access, toxic people lose their grip, automatically. The attention economy of toxicity. Toxic people don't care if you agree with them. They care if you notice them. This is the core mistake most people make. They believe attention is a reward only when it's positive. In reality, attention is control, not agreement. Every time you explain yourself, defend your position, or react emotionally, you move toxic people back to the center of the exchange. You give them relevance. They don't need validation. They need focus. Explaining feels reasonable. Defending feels justified. Reacting feels human. But all three keep the toxic person active in your psychological space. Once they are central, they influence tempo, tone, and direction. They decide when the conversation continues and when it escalates. This is why negative attention still sustains influence. Arguments don't weaken toxic people. They energize them. Even anger tells them they matter. Even frustration confirms access. Even correction proves engagement. From their perspective, any sustained response is success. This is the attention economy of toxicity. They provoke to extract focus. They repeat behaviors that keep them visible. They escalate when relevance drops. Silence disrupts this economy. When attention disappears, the reward structure collapses. There is no feedback loop, no emotional return. This is why silence feels uncomfortable at first. You are breaking a pattern they depend on. But here's the critical point most people miss. Silence must be clean. Half silence still leaks relevance, watching their reactions obsessively, talking about them to others, replaying conversations mentally. All of this keeps them alive in your mind, and that influence leaks back into behavior. True silence removes attention internally and externally. Machiavelli understood that influence requires access. Remove access, and power dissolves. This doesn't mean pretending they don't exist. It means refusing to center them. Your focus returns to your actions, your decisions, your direction. They become peripheral. Over time, behavior that isn't rewarded fades. Toxic people don't change because they understand you. They change because the environment stops feeding them. And when silence is paired with discipline, irrelevance follows. But silence alone isn't enough. Most people still leak relevance without realizing it. The trap of emotional justification. Toxic people rarely attack boundaries directly. They question them. They provoke explanations on purpose. Not because they're confused, but because explanation reopens the door they're trying to walk through. The moment you justify a boundary, you turn it from a decision into a discussion. And discussion is leverage. Toxic people understand this instinctively. They don't say, "You can't do that." They say, "Why are you being like this? Why are you overreacting? I don't understand what I did wrong." Each question is bait. If you respond emotionally, you're no longer enforcing a limit. You're negotiating it. Emotion turns limits into debate. When feelings enter the explanation, the boundary stops being firm. It becomes conditional. Now they know what guilt moves you, what doubt weakens you, what justification you rely on. They push there. This is why emotional justification is so dangerous. It feels fair. It feels respectful. It feels like you're being mature. But what you're actually doing is keeping the interaction alive. Machiavelli understood that power is not maintained by being understood. It's maintained by being consistent. A calm decision ends a conversation. An emotional explanation extends it. This is the shift most people struggle with. They think firmness requires aggression. It doesn't. It requires finality, a simple statement. No story, no defense, no emotional charge. When you stop explaining, the toxic person loses footing. There's nothing to argue with, nothing to twist, nothing to escalate. They may push harder at first. That's not strength, it's habit. They are testing whether the door is actually closed. Once they realize it is, behavior changes. Not because they suddenly respect you, but because there is nothing left to extract. Calm decisions remove oxygen from manipulation. They signal that your boundaries are not reactions, they are positions. And positions don't require justification. So what actually shuts the door instead of keeping it half open? The Machiavellian trick: remove function, not the person. The mistake most people make with toxic individuals is trying to defeat them. They argue harder, they explain more clearly, they expose behavior publicly, and every attempt keeps the toxic person functional. Machiavelli's insight was colder and far more effective. You don't attack character, you remove utility. Toxic people don't operate on morals, they operate on reward. Their behavior serves a function: emotional reactions, access to your attention, control over your mood, influence over your decisions. As long as that function exists, the behavior continues. This is why confrontation rarely works. Arguing still gives reaction. Calling them out still gives attention. Explaining still gives access. You may feel strong, but you're still feeding the mechanism. Removing function means cutting off what the behavior extracts. No reaction, no emotional labor, no availability on demand. Not dramatically, not angrily, calmly. This is where power dissolves without resistance. When toxic behavior stops producing results, it doesn't escalate forever. It fades, because behavior without reward has no purpose. Machiavelli understood this principle deeply. Power does not require force when the system supporting it collapses. You don't need to prove they're wrong. You don't need to expose intent. You don't need closure. You simply stop being useful to the behavior. This is uncomfortable for people who rely on moral confrontation. It feels passive. It feels unfinished. But passivity is not the same as withdrawal of function. You are not doing nothing. You are doing the most disruptive thing possible. You are making their tactics inefficient. When reaction disappears, manipulation loses calibration. When access disappears, pressure loses accuracy. When emotional labor disappears, control evaporates. This doesn't make you cruel. It makes you unusable. And unusable targets are abandoned quickly. Toxic people don't reform because they understand you. They move on because you no longer serve a role. That is the Machiavellian trick. No resistance, no battle, no drama, just removal of function. But this only works if your internal state stops reacting first. Internal detachment, where real control begins. Real control doesn't begin with behavior. It begins with detachment. As long as your internal state reacts automatically, manipulation remains possible. Because reaction is access. Emotional neutrality breaks manipulation not by force, but by starvation. When nothing inside you moves on command, there is nothing for pressure to grab. This is where many people misunderstand detachment. They confuse it with suppression. They think it means becoming cold, numb, or disconnected. It doesn't. Detachment is not the absence of feeling. It is clarity about where energy goes. You still feel irritation. You still notice disrespect. You simply don't hand control of your nervous system to it. Machiavelli understood that power collapses when emotion dictates movement. Whoever can pull your internal state can pull your decisions. Detachment interrupts that chain. When you stop feeding emotion into the exchange, something shifts immediately. Provocation loses accuracy. Insults land flat. Pressure misses its target. Calm makes provocation expensive. A toxic person expects escalation or defense. They plan around reaction. When reaction doesn't arrive, they experience friction. They don't know how to proceed. This is the moment control changes hands. Internal detachment also restores choice. Instead of asking, "How should I respond?" you ask, "Is response even required?" Instead of managing their behavior, you manage your attention. You decide where energy flows, what deserves engagement, what exits your mind immediately. This is not avoidance. It is prioritization. When your internal state stabilizes, external behavior becomes optional. Toxic people rely on urgency. Detachment removes it. They rely on emotional hooks. Detachment dulls them. They rely on repetition. Detachment breaks the loop. Over time, this neutrality becomes visible, not as indifference, as self-command. Others feel it before they understand it. They sense that pressure doesn't move you, that escalation doesn't speed you up. This changes how people approach you. Less testing, less provocation, less noise. And this is where something unexpected happens. Once detachment stabilizes, the dynamic doesn't just weaken, it reverses. How irrelevance rewrites power dynamics. When toxic people feel relevance slipping, they don't calm down, they escalate. This escalation is often misread as strength. In reality, it's panic. Toxic behavior depends on attention. When reactions fade, the system that sustained their influence starts failing. So they push harder, not to win, but to be seen again. This is the turning point most people mishandle. They see escalation and think ignoring doesn't work. What they're actually witnessing is withdrawal symptoms. As relevance fades, behavior spikes briefly. Then it collapses. At the same time, something else happens quietly. Others notice who no longer reacts. They see who remains calm, who doesn't defend, who doesn't rush to explain. And humans instinctively assign status based on this contrast. Reaction reads as involvement. Non-reaction reads as position. Status shifts without confrontation. No argument, no exposure, no dramatic moment, just a subtle reassignment of hierarchy. The person who stopped reacting becomes harder to move. The person who keeps provoking begins to look unstable. This is how silence reframes the narrative. Instead of you being affected, the focus turns outward. Why are they trying so hard? Why are they still pushing? The story flips without a word spoken. Machiavelli understood that power is often lost through over-participation. The more you engage, the more you legitimize the exchange. Irrelevance does the opposite. It removes you from the center of their behavior. And once you are no longer central, influence dissolves. Toxic people don't need enemies. They need audiences. When the audience disappears, the performance ends. This is why silence is so disruptive. Not dramatic silence, not passive-aggressive silence, neutral absence, no emotional residue, no follow-up explanations, no internal replay, just disengagement paired with composure. Over time, the environment adjusts. Others speak differently around you. They test less. They assume boundaries without being told. And the toxic individual, they move on. Not because they learned a lesson, but because the interaction stopped paying. This is the quiet rewrite of power dynamics. No dominance, no victory speech, just a shift in gravity. And this leads to the final state Machiavelli actually aimed for. The final state, unusable, unreactive, untouchable. The end state Machiavelli pointed toward was never victory over others. It was freedom from being usable. Toxic people don't leave because they understand your boundaries. They leave when influence fails, when reaction no longer comes, when access is no longer guaranteed, when effort produces no return. At that point, something important becomes clear. You don't win. You simply stop being worth targeting. This is the most misunderstood part of power psychology. People imagine power as dominance, out-arguing, outplaying, outlasting. Machiavelli understood power differently. Power is absence. It's what happens when someone can no longer pull you into their frame, when your attention doesn't spike, when your emotions don't accelerate, when your behavior doesn't change. Toxic people are not drawn to strength, they are drawn to utility. Once utility disappears, so does interest. Calm, selective engagement filters your environment automatically. You don't need to announce boundaries. You don't need to confront behavior. You don't need to explain distance. People feel it. They sense when interaction with you requires effort instead of reaction. They sense when access is conditional, not automatic. Those who respect boundaries remain. Those who seek leverage leave. This is not isolation. It is filtration. Power through absence, not dominance. Dominance invites challenge. Absence ends the game. When you stop feeding toxicity, the entire dynamic rewrites itself. Escalation looks desperate instead of intimidating. Provocation looks exposed instead of clever. Silence looks stable instead of weak. Others adjust their behavior around you without being told to. They become more careful, more precise, more respectful, not because you demanded it, but because pressure no longer works. This is the Machiavellian end state, unusable because reaction isn't available, unreactive because emotion isn't weaponized, untouchable because influence has no entry point. You haven't defeated anyone. You've simply exited their economy. And once someone realizes they can't move you, they stop trying. Comment, "I don't feed toxicity," or comment, "Relevance is power." Subscribe if you want more Iron Psyche breakdowns on power, psychology, and mental clarity. This channel isn't about noise, it's about position.